gentlemen, welcome. Tonight we're here to tell you a story. It's the story of Boris and Bessie Thomashefsky, two kids from little shtetls in the middle of a Ukrainian nowhere who came to America and became the founder pioneers of the American Yiddish Theater. They also happen to be my grandparents. They were big stars who lived out the fantasies of their audience, and the Yiddish Theater was all about its audience. There were some connoisseurs, some mavens and kenners in that crowd, but lots were what you call goylem dicke greenhorns, immigrant innocents fresh off the boat. And the mission of the Yiddish Theater was to entertain, educate, and elevate this audience. In an ironic way, its highest purpose turned out to be putting itself out of business. But before we begin their story, as my grandmother always used to say when I asked her anything, first I gotta bring out. What you're going to hear tonight is a mixture of things. Most of it comes from original sources, my grandparents' autobiographies, newspaper articles, the scripts and scores from which the musicians played the shows over 100 years ago. But I've measured all these sources against the way my family told me these stories when I was a boy. I heard these stories countless times, and let me tell you, every time I heard them, they were a little bit different. Well, tonight I'm going to try and give you the essence of what all the different tellings seem to be saying. What's the real truth? Who knows? The spirit of the Yiddish Theater, like that of my grandparents' lives, was one of wild improvisation, like the instruction in the violin part of one of Bessie's shows that said, "Fake something charming until Mrs. Thomashefsky leaves the stage." So what better way to start than with music? That was the March of the Jewish Suffragettes. The finale from Chanche in America, one of my Grandma Bessie's biggest hits. 100 years ago, she knocked them dead season after season with that show. And 50 years later, she had installed herself at a fashionable Hollywood hotel where she enjoyed experiencing what she called lobby life. And every Friday, she arrived at our house to spend the weekend looking after me. Well, she was a special kind of grandma. She was in her 80s, Her hair was flame red. She had 6 or 8 bracelets up each arm, a long cigarette holder, wraparound sunglasses. She'd settle herself on the chaise longue in the backyard and read enormous stacks of Yiddish newspapers while haranguing the squirrels. I can still hear her moaning, "Oi, oi, it's a changing world." Well, sometimes I'd be aware of her looking at me, studying me. She'd say, "I see you. I see who you are. You know, you're like me. Your parents are very nice people, but you know, they're really terribly conventional. Let me tell you about life. You're going to have to live your life as you have to live it, whatever it costs. That's what I did, your grandma. And do you know what they said about me? Some said I was a femme fatale, a bohemian, a wilde Chaya. But no one ever said I gave anything less than an impassioned performance. And the truth is, Mechler, there's no such thing as an impassioned performance without a little raw material." Well, every weekend we put on a little show for whoever showed up at dinner. She'd do recitations, contrive little skits for us to play together, and then she'd bring out one of her big party pieces.
Hab ich mir am Mantel fin verzeitigen Stoff, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la-la, hat nitten sich kein einzigen Stoch, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la. Dann hab ich sich betracht, in fin dem Mantel a Reckele gemacht, tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la, 1, 2, 3. Hab ich mir a Reckl fin verzeitigen Stoff, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la-la, hat nitten sich kein einzigen Stoch, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la. Dann hab ich sich betracht, in fin dem Räkele a Käschene gemacht. Tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la, 1, 2, 3. Hab ich mir a Käschen fin verzeitigen Stoff, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la-la, hat nitten sich kein einzigen Stoch, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la. Dann hab ich sich betracht, in fin dem Käschene a gar nicht gemacht. Tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la, 1, 2, 3. Hab ich mir gar nicht fin verzeitigen Stoff, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la, hat nitten sich kein einzigen Stoch, tra-la-la-la-la-la. Dann hab ich sich betracht, in fin dem gar nicht a Liedele gemacht. Tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la, 1, 2, 3. Das ist gar nicht. Das ist gar nicht. Du weißt nicht, wer ich bin.
Ah, du weißt nicht, wer ich bin. You don't know who I am. I heard her say that so many times, but how could anybody know? She had outlived nearly everyone. Her colleagues, her audience, her friends. She used to say, "My friends, some died, the others got rich." But even 50 years before, she'd been asking who she was. In 1915, she had written her first autobiography, which began with this introduction.
Dear reader, here I sit now in my wardrobe, in my dressing room, thinking back about everything. I study myself in the mirrors that showed me countless times that I was not myself, but someone else. I rub my hand over the costumes that enfold me when I was a queen, a beggar, a crusty old bubba, even a dashing prince. And there is the makeup that disguised my face so many times that I forgot I had a face of my own. Any minute now, I'll have to get myself dressed and made up and become somebody else all over again. The audience always demands something new, What do they know or care who else I've played? For them, this afternoon's heroine is already dead and cold, let alone the one I played to sell out crowds 3 years ago. No. And me? I sit in my dressing room, searching my mirror for traces of me. The old scenes tumble through my thoughts like leaves in a windstorm. Write my life story? Sure, but who will it interest? The life of an actress. A Yiddish actress. Wees mir.
Well, to know who Bessie was, we have to start with who she was in the old country. She was born Bessie Baumfeld in 1873 in Tarascha, a small shtetl outside of Kiev. Her father was a chassid, a follower of the Talmud Rebbe. Now, a key crisis in her childhood was when she began stuttering. A plague swept through their village, and in her terror, Bessie became unintelligible. Her parents took her to a miracle healer who cured her by giving her magic crackers. There was a cracker inscribed with each letter on which she stuttered. And he fixed her in his eyes and said, "Little one, take these crackers home. Every day your mama will dissolve one in a glass of milk. And as you drink the milk, the letter will fill you. And on that letter, never again will you stutter." It worked. Now, for me, this story evokes the world in which Bessie would work, the world of the theater and the transforming power of imagination. In 1881, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the family joined a wave of left-leaning Jews heading for America. They landed at Castle Garden with a new name, Kaufman. They tried their luck at communal farming, and one disastrous year later, they were in Baltimore looking for work. My great-grandfather peddled eyeglasses on the street. Bessie blossomed into a vivacious, blonde, blue-eyed girl. She worked as a tobacco stripper and was thrilled to get 3 cents an hour. So after a 60-hour week, she could give her parents $1.98 and still have a few pennies left over for some amusements.
In the Dime Museum on West Baltimore Street, I broke every Sabbath. I used to love watching the Punch and Judy shows and hearing the minstrels sing. Then one day, my girlfriend, Annie Zilberstein, took me to the Masonic Temple on West Street, and there I saw Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. I trembled all over. It was my first time ever seeing real theater. It seemed to me that actors were the luckiest people in the world, what with everybody talking about them and the papers writing about them. Now that's what I call living.
Well, now let's talk about Boris. In fact, let's listen to him. Now, when I talk to you about Boris, it's different. He died before I was born, so for me, as for you, he's a legend. Of course, I've heard all the stories and jokes about him. Thousands of people must have come up to me and said, you know, when I was a kid and behaved wildly, my mother would say, "Look who's a Thomashefsky." But his name is still around. He's mentioned in Gershwin songs and features as a ghostly presence in The Producers. He's a theatrical legend, all right, but what was he really like? What's clear to me now is that Boris was a great singer, a powerful actor, and visionary producer. He had great sexual magnetism, charm, and a flamboyant, self-destructive personality. What else do you need to be a legend? Boris also came from the Ukraine. He was born in 1868 in Asitsnyachka, a small shtetl outside of Kiev. He was 7 years older than Bessie. Now, for generations, Boris's family had been cantors for the Talna Rebbes, but Pinchas, my great-grandfather, had what they called in those days a restless spirit. He couldn't stay focused, and instead of studying Talmud, he read plays in Russian and German and improvised every day for hours on the violin. But, respectful to the family's tradition, he sent his 8-year-old son Boris to Berdichev to study in the choir school of Nissen Belzer at what was then the most famous synagogue in Russia. There, Boris soon became a soloist. By age 11, he was beginning to discover who he was.
I was a good musician and a good-looking lad. People liked listening to me, and they liked looking at me. One of those people was the pretty daughter of the local tavern keeper. People called her the princess of the tavern. Her name was Bashka. One day I noticed her peeking out from behind the curtains of the women's gallery as I sang my solo. She was staring straight into my eyes. From that moment on, I sang not for the Berdichev public, but for Bashka. One Shabbos, I was standing on the bima with Red Neeson in the choir as usual. Bashka's eyes were riveted on me. I was so entranced that when it came time to sing my solo, I didn't come in. Red Neeson saw that I was staring at Bashka and administered a flaming slap to my face. Well, I realized what I had done and felt as though I committed a sin, but a slap in shul, witnessed by Bashka, that was too much. I refused to sing. There was no other soprano who knew my solo, and there was no way to continue the service. There was a commotion in shul. Suddenly, the Berdichev Rebbe rose from his upholstered seat near the eastern wall. He came over to me in his old, trembling voice. He said, "Little boy, remember where you are. This is a holy place. Sing, little boy." I began to sing. I sang very well. In fact, I had never sung so well before. When I had finished, there was an eerie silence, and then applause. Red Neeson shouted, "Silence! This is not a theater. There is no clapping here." Well, afterwards, Red Neeson gave me the whipping of my life. Never mind. From that moment on, I knew what I wanted in life. Music, drama, applause, women, and not necessarily in that order.
By 1881, when the family escaped to America, Boris had become a famous soloist. They called him the Canary of Berdichev. In New York, right off the boat, he was hired to be the soloist of the Henry Street Shul. His salary, $5 a week, and they paid him a month in advance. The next day, Boris met Frank Wolf, the ambitious, saloon-owning president of the Henry Street Shul. Boris and Wolf hit it off right away, and Wolf took Boris for his first trip around New York.
Wolf took me to a matinee performance on the Bowery, a melodrama starring a certain In S. Woods on stage, non-stop stabbing, shooting, burning, leaping from cliffs. I loved it. Afterwards, Wolf asked me how I liked the play. I said that I really liked that young actor. In fact, I envied him, wanted to be just like him. Ha! You want to be an actor, Frank Wolf laughed. My boy, first you have to grow up, become a young man, even learn English. Do you really love theater that much? Not English theater, I said. Yiddish Theater!
And Boris knew what he was talking about. Knocking his way across Europe, he'd gotten to know about Yiddish theater, and especially the work of its pioneering master, Avram Goldfaden.
I knew about a troupe of Romanian actors currently at liberty in London who had recently performed Goldfaden's occult operetta Kodulnya, the Sorceress. At 14, I convinced Wolf to bring them to New York and present them in what would be America's first Yiddish theater performance.
But the idea of a bunch of newcomer East European Jews doing a play in Yiddish didn't sit well with the already long-established Dutch, German, American Jewish community. They formed a vigilante committee to shut down the show and deport the players, many of whom had already arrived.
The prize catch was the famous diva, Madame Kransfeld.
Madame Kransfeld was a Yiddish prima donna assoluta. In Kodulnya, she had established herself in the take-no-prisoners role of Mirele, who never leaves the stage and carries on like a Jewish Lucia de Lammermoor.
Was kann ich euch erzählen weiter? Wir kennen seinen schlechten Leid.
Well, Boris assumed control of the rehearsals, but there were problems. Madame Kransfeld didn't want to rehearse. She claimed to be fatigued, didn't want to strain her voice. She was saving herself, she said, for the performance. So, during the rehearsals, Boris sang all of her songs too. At last, the day of the big premiere arrived, and the orchestra struck up the overture.
The orchestra was already playing the overture when we realized our prima donna was missing. Kranzfeld! Kranzfeld! I ran down to her dressing room. It was dark. Her costume was still there, but as for Kranzfeld herself, there was no sign. What to do? Go to her house. I yelled, "Professor, keep playing the overture. I'll be back!" I found her sitting there with a kerchief tied around her head. Kranzfeld, what's wrong? Let's go. The orchestra is playing the overture for the second time. Maybe even the third time. Quite calmly, she said she was auf Zurich, that she was kopfwehtig, zahnwehtig, and hoarse besides. In short, she couldn't possibly go on. We would have to postpone the performance till she felt better. I yelled, I begged, but it was like talking to a wall. So I left her there with a headache and a toothache, and I ran back to the hall. I ran down to her dressing room, put on her dress, patted myself in all the right places, and I was ready. It is a matter of public record that the first Yiddish theatrical presentation in America, I played the starring role of Mirala. I was the prima donna. Then, in the third act, I changed into the costume of the boy and sang my little song. Then I changed back into the dress, played the final number, and took the bows. On this night, the legend of Boris Thomashefsky was launched. As for Kranzfeld, it turned out she had been bribed by the immigration committee to throw the show. Her reward? A soda fountain on Rivington Street with 2 spigots. Thanks to her, I became an overnight sensation. I created my first troupe featuring me as impresario and prima donna. But then, disaster struck. My voice changed. In despair, I left the city. It took 2 years for his voice to settle into a rich baritone. By the time he returned to New York, he was a 16-year-old has-been curiosity. He gathered up some of his old troupe and hit the road. He still played female parts, but he was becoming a leading man and began sporting his signature stovepipe hat. Yes, I was making more fans every day. I was still only in my late teens, but girls and even grown women would run to my performances, in part because of my singing and acting. Whatever it was, I had it. I was a star and a box office draw, and my fellow actors knew that I could pull in a crowd.
And now the stage is set for Boris and Bessie, two immigrant kids from next-door shtetls in the Ukraine, to meet in Baltimore.
Entschuldig mir, Mechele. First, I gotta bring out. It was my sister Clara and my brother-in-law Louis Levitsky who was stage-struck. One day, Louis came with miraculous news. A bunch of Yiddish komediantschiks were in town and they had given Louis tickets to their shows. I couldn't wait to go to the opening night, but as I was getting dressed, my papa said that going to such a scandalous event would ruin my chances for making a good match. So, I put on my own drama in the kitchen, screaming, geschreing, pulling my hair, till my mama slipped me a quarter and I snuck out the back door. I walked in the rain to the little hall where about 90 go-to-bed-early Jews were yawning their heads off. Finally, at 9 o'clock, the show started. What a show! Act 1. A skinny Yiddish sang a blessing over the candles and went away. In came a flashy shiksa who said something in Russian, and then suddenly arrived a handsome young Hasid with beautiful payas and big dark eyes. The shiksa tried to flirt with him, but he said nothing doing and went away. Then the shiksa whistled, and two goyim brought in a dead child and hid it in the Jew's house. Curtain. Act 2. All the Jews were in prison. Mujiks were beating them up. Zets, zets, zets. Then the handsome Hasid sang a tearful prayer. The audience wept and cursed the goyim. That's all. Act 3. The Jews were in Siberia. Boy, were they cold. Some of the nice women in the audience passed their shawls up to the actors so they should warm up. Act 4. The Goyim wanted to massacre all the Jews because they said that they had murdered a Gentile child to complete the making of matzos. The whole audience jumped up screaming, "No, no, it's a lie! That Shiksa Kurva and her friends did it! People, Alele Stam, Arik auf den Tatenstater rein!" Well, the audience won the Goyim over, the Jews were all freed, and everybody bravoed their heads off. And now came a surprise. Out came that same young, handsome Hasid, only now he was clean-shaven.
I was sporting a dashing frock coat, a red vest with black buttons, a red bow tie, and red stockings. I let the audience have it with my surefire songs.
Nicht ein Mensch auf der Welt, was lebt ob seine Jahren, mit dem Wind zu verdienen, das bissle Geld, am Loche ist Sorn. Freut sich zu verdienen, was regt, Rebben ist für ihm a Bische, kriegt nur a Jom, sie es ist. In het zeef der Tapen, a fette Rieche, krank ist wie euch, als euch sie horven mit dem Schweiß. indem sie schreien in mir hoch. Babkelech idelech koi. Heise babkelech idelech koi. Heise babkelech idelech koi.
After the show, I waited at the stage door for half an hour until finally the actors came out, including that handsome singer. I couldn't help myself. I ran over to him and I gave him a look right in the eyes. Then I ran home. Later, I found out his name was Boris Thomashefsky.
Well, the next day, Bessie was in a daze. She quit her job and stumbled around town singing the songs she had heard in the theater the night before and dreaming about Boris. And then, one night, he showed up as a guest for dinner at her sister's house.
He saw me and asked, "Who's the girl with the long braids?" Clara answered that I was her little sister. He went to touch the hair on my shoulders, but snatched back his hand with a cry, "Oi!" showing me where he had stuck himself on my hairpins. Taking his hand to his mouth, he sucked at the blood and said to me with a smile, "Young lady, you've stuck me through and through."
Well, from then on, Boris began hanging around Bessie's house. Then came the night of his second show.
I arrived backstage after the second act. I was standing in the wings, and suddenly a beautiful woman sailed onto the stage. She had blonde hair, a clinging red velvet dress, dazzling jewelry. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, the way she looked at men. I never imagined a woman could be like that. She disappeared. The next thing I knew, somebody gave me a pinch in the tuchus. I turned around and it was her. Then she laughed and said, "Hello, baby. Don't you know me? It's me, your favorite actor. How'd you like my performance?" Then I realized she was him, Thomashefsky. I blushed and couldn't speak a word. Then after the show, we went back to his dressing room. He was still in his red dress, but he had taken off his wig. We were all there, my family, his friends and admirers. But he ignored them all and came across the room to me. To me! He caressed my hair. Oh, this time I had let it fall loose so he shouldn't stick himself a second time. He caressed my cheek. He looked right into my eyes and said, "Oi, is du so schöne Mädel?" And that was it. That was really the first time. Boris and me.
Boris began teaching Bessie everything he knew about being a charming woman. As she told me in later years, all my life, those men, how they pursued me. They couldn't get enough of me. Little did they know that what they were admiring was your grandfather's performance.
The company's run in Baltimore had long since ended, but I didn't want to leave because of Bessie. I don't know why, I don't know how it happened, but at that moment I felt that in spite of all my romances, all my experiences with the fair sex, beautiful little Bessie had won my heart in a very serious way. I wanted to be with her all the time.
Well, what he wanted was for her to be with him on the road. She was essential, he said, to their upcoming production in New York, and he gave her 2 hours to decide to go with him. Her father reluctantly agreed to let her go maybe for a week or so. So she hopped a milk train and moved in with the Thomashefskys in their Lower East Side tenement.
Right away, we gave her a makeover and put her on the stage.
15 years old, and there I was in the title role. between my scenes. I sat in the beautiful dressing room I shared with my director. Imagine. I looked in the full-length mirror and dressed up for the third act. I never wanted to take off my costume. I was intoxicated with happiness. I never wanted to go home.
And she didn't. Soon afterwards, the kids were married. Bessie had lied about her age. She was barely 16. Boris began to develop a lavish style of showmanship. His acting, his singing, his spectacles, in the minds of his audience, it was summed up with one word: Thomashefsky.
I gave my show splendid productions, itself a guarantee of success. Bear in mind that in those days there were no movies one could pay 10 cents to see a production that had cost millions. I was the only one who staggered the Yiddish public with gold and silver curtains, lavish sets, and spectacular electric lights. Crowds flocked to my theater. I always did better business than my competitors. And competitors I had. New York teemed with self-proclaimed headliners fresh from their triumphs at the Imperial Theater of Gornischberg. Most were unimportant, but among them, Jacob P. Adler, the great classic actor of the Yiddish Theater. We were lifelong friends and rivals. We kept this rivalry alive by our warring fans, the so-called Patrioten. These patriots had to swear allegiance to one star or another and would go to great lengths to prove their devotion. We would often fan the flames by putting on the exact same play at the same time. That way, the patriots had to run back and forth from theater to theater and then hang out in cafes all night arguing about whose interpretation was the best. Sometimes it came to blows, and it all sold tickets.
And now came the first mega hit of Boris's career, Alexander, the Crown Prince of Jerusalem. It was a stunning vehicle for Boris, the singer, and Boris, the sexy young guy in tights. The plot of Alexander begins. A young prince of Jerusalem is told by his father he must seek a bride. Having found no maidens to his liking in Palestine, he widens his search to a land bearing an uncanny resemblance to Romania. There, disguised as a bird catcher, he meets the young maiden Naomi.
In this, my biggest scene, Alexander enters, searching for his beloved at the well, where they had previously arranged to meet.
Geflogen käm ich wieder, ich mein Liebchen hier zu sehen. Sich zieht sie meine Lieder, mit dir allein. Wie geflogen käm ich wieder, ich mein Liebchen hier zu sehen. Sich zieht meine Lieder, mit dir allein. Oh, du nur allein lebst in mein Herzen, nur zu dir hab ich List. Oh, voll Sehnsuchten, liebe Schmerzen, ist voll meine Brust. Zieh mein Singen, hör sich zieh, o Kim, mich war nach dir, die Klänge klingen der Melodie, o Kim zu mir. O Donner, lebst in mein Herzen, nur zu dir, ob ich liest, o mein Sehnsuchten, liebe Schmerzen, meine Brust. Wie geflogen käm ich wieder, mein Liebchen hier zu sehen. Sich zieht meine Lieder, gewidmet dir.
Das Paradies war mir offen, da zäubern schön verdient ihr. Maritz, was soll ich noch mehr hoffen, wenn Träum war alles nur.
Allein lebt sie mein Herzen, nur zu dir, wo ich lief. Wo heute so friedliche Schmerzen ist voll meiner List.
Meine Stimme, ach, du sind allein, ach, du sind allein, ach, du sind
Geliebte, Geliebte meines Herzens, ach mein Liebe, ach mein Liebe. Ich will mich mit dir verliebt, wenn meine Augen nicht erblickt, wenn mir sich, wenn wir schämen, wenn mir sich, wenn wir schämen, wenn mir sich, wenn wir schämen, wenn mir sich, wenn wir schämen.
Doch wenn die kimmst, doch wenn die kimmst,
Bleib scheu, nur bei mir, geh nicht mehr von vor dir. Und bleib scheu, nur bei mir, geh nicht mehr von vor dir. Nein,
On the audience was incredible. Respectable women stormed the stage and literally ripped their clothes off. I received countless gifts, many with addresses and room keys. The crazy success of this piece allowed me to greatly expand my lifestyle. I hired a staff to look after me, including a dresser, Max, the Meshuggah. One of Max's responsibilities was to check out the ladies before each performance and admit only the most delicious ones to a special box reserved for my use. It had only a partial view of the stage, and I would retire there between scenes to tryst with my admirers. Sometimes I got so caught up in my trysting I was tardy making my next entrance. A few times I even sang my lines from the box, which became known as the Love Nest.
Well, the Alexander phenomenon was too much for Adler. He knew he couldn't compete with Thomashefsky on his own territory. So he decided to win back the audience's attention with something unprecedented in Yiddish theater, Shakespeare. Adler announced from his stage that he would play King Lear.
So the next night I announced from my stage I will be playing Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. The audience went wild. But truthfully, what did all those Jews know from Shakespeare and Hamlet? About as much as they knew from a ham and cheese sandwich. They thought it was another operetta with another prince.
Adler opened in Lear, and it was neither a Machaya nor a Broch. It was great, but it didn't do enough business. Neither did Boris's Hamlet. But Boris developed an adaptation of Hamlet, a Hasidic Hamlet, which he called the Yeshiva Bucha. He announced on his famous poster, "The Yeshiva Bucha, Finn William Shakespeare," translated and improved by Boris Thomashefsky. In this form, the play became a major hit for him the rest of his life.
So, why did I do Hamlet my way? It all had to do with my audience. I had to introduce it to them in such a way they would understand. For example, the scene where Hamlet first speaks to his father's ghost. "O Father, answer me. Tell me why thy canonized bones have burst their cerement. Why thy sepulchre hath oped its ponderous and marble jaw to cast thee up again." I knew that would never work. So instead, I gave him... Mein Vater! Mein Vater! Oi! 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 The audience ate it up! At the curtain call, they shouted, "Author! Author!" I had to tell them that Shakespeare was unavoidably detained. From this moment, Shakespeare became a part of their lives, and it started them on the journey to the real Shakespeare. That's what mattered to me.
Meanwhile, Bessie had blossomed as an actress and mother, but she still had unfinished business with her father. By him, she was still a wayward girl who would run off with a komedianshik no goodnik. She didn't know how to make it up to him. Once again, it was the crazy magic of theater that resolved them.
We were on tour playing Baltimore. All day long, I hid in my dressing room until finally, hours after the show, Boris and I snuck out the stage door, and there he was, my father. I threw myself at his feet and burst into terrible sobbing. After a while, my father softly said, "I forgive you, children." So, after all this time, why did he forgive us? It was the show. In that show, Boris rescued me so many times that my virtue had stretch marks. But my father thought it was all real. "Boris," he said, "I never trusted you, but tonight you proved to me how much you love my daughter, my Bougela. I saw how you sacrificed yourself for her sake and even shot yourself. Live together in peace and grow old together in pride and pleasure." That's the power of show business.
The theater had become a family affair. If you had any talent at all, you were on the stage. If you were hopeless, you worked in the box office. Bessie's children, Esther and Harry, grew up on the stage and became child stars. The Thomashefskys' next show was not only a hit, it was a defining moment in the Yiddish theater. It was called Das Pintele Yid. Now, the title Pintele Yid is difficult to translate into English. It takes its meaning from a play on words. In Hebrew, in Yiddish, the voicing of the consonants is indicated by small dots around the consonants. It's these dots, or pintelach, that can change the letter Yud into the word Yid, Jew. So what makes a Jew a Jew? A little dot, nothing, and yet everything. The show had something for everybody. People sang the songs in their tenements and sweatshops, and the title song was originally introduced by my Uncle Harry And its simple little melody still carries a message of tears and triumph.
Kovet und Stolz macht es dir Jid. Macht es in Schätze sie nicht.
Das Pinteleid, überregen schein vor den Pinteleid. Gemacht hat deine Gliederlach, gepeinigt deine Brüderlach, geworden sich hat jeder in dein Glied. Wir wurden unerzogen und Pinteleid, doch mit in deiner Mord bleibt das Pinteleid. Der König ist alle Kalach und ihrer Monitor im Leib bei dem Pinteleid. Überregen schein ist das Pinteleid, überregen schein vor den Pinteleid.
In this show, Bessie played the part of a boy opposite her own son, Harry. And every night she improvised slightly new verses that gave the fans the chance to chuckle about the foibles of the young folks of their day.
The latest fashion nowadays, so troubling to daughters and mamas. Their daughters sneak out for a walk to act out the following dramas. They play their scenes with such flashing eyes that they promise you are the one. They've got adoring supporting casts, all the neighborhood boys out for fun. What's the deal? What's the spiel? What's the sound on the stoop of a squeal? No. Give a guess. Come on and give a guess. These things are plain and simple, easy to explain. Give a guess. Don't hold back. Sugar pass. Hauptsache jeden. Come and give a guess. a method never fails to teach girls to bang a piano. He gives her lessons 3 times a week, stressing passages, fingering scales. And then one morning she's feeling sick, and nobody knows from what she ails. What distress, but a mess. What's the shanda she's got to converse? No. Give a guess, come on and give a guess. These things are plain and simple, easy to explain. Give a guess, don't hold back, sing a pass. Hauptsache Lieder, come and give a guess. Was willst du?
The most triumphant number in that show was the Bar Mitzvah March. It was a vast production number with streams of neighborhood kids pouring down the aisles, including George and Ira Gershwin. Jewish and American flags were unfurled in a truly baffo finale.
Celebrate your Yiddish, sing a little Liederlach. Each day a holy one, he gives us so es Findelach. The whole wide world joins in singing a Mazel Tov. Why such a wonder of wilder gepaart? Now all the nachrichts from every bar mitzvah boy spreads on and on around the ganze Welt. Wenn alle Liederlach, sind es schöne Liederlach. Seid listig, geht, Felix, mit der Beine niederlacht. Wenn alle Liederlach, sind es schöne Liederlach. Der Wolle hat bewiesen, die ist wieder wie Berlach. This day makes you a man. Step up and take your brothers by the hand. Give praise to God and you, in the thought and you, who cherishes every soul that's new. Their heart of presence high, my conscience is there, is rising high. But in the God and you, in the thought and you, sie liebt den Teil, ihren Kindern you. Jo, in der Teure, ist nur bei uns die beste Freude. Die größte Freude ist bei uns versinkt. Jo, sie liebt den Heilen Kind. Ahoi! Wenn alle Liederlach, sind es schöne Liederlach. Seid nicht geht, wenn ich mit der Beine niederlach. Wenn alle Liederlach, sind es schöne Liederlach.
Well, Pintele Yid made the name Thomashefsky a household word. But what was beginning to happen was that Bessie more and more was emerging as a theatrical personality in her own right. On and off the stage, Bessie tried out lots of new looks and gradually changed from a simple, innocent village girl to a confident and worldly-wise Americanin. She became a glamorous trendsetter by following the advice of a young kid she took on and who became her lifelong beauty consultant, Max Factor. But Bessie never forgot her origins in that little Ukrainian shtetl, and she wanted to help fresh off the boat girls find their own new looks in America. She started a beauty column in the newspaper Die Wahrheit and advised girls on how to take care of themselves. July 22nd, 1917.
Was tut ihr für euer Hals?
What do you do for your throat? An important part of the body that many women neglect.
By Bessie Thomashefsky. When I go out on the street, I like to look at people. Very often I see many women and young girls with altogether beautiful faces, altogether charming in appearance, smartly dressed, but something about their beauty is not harmonious. And as I look, I see what the trouble is. Their throats are a different color from their faces.
This makes such a bad impression, and especially now in the summer when it's hot and perspiration is flowing like molasses. If the throat is rather dark and a little wrinkled besides, oi, that is not pretty.
A woman's throat is the first thing that betrays her age. The folds and wrinkles that show up under the chin and near the ears provide the testimony. That is why it is important for a woman not to allow her throat to wrinkle.
This can be accomplished by light massage, done by yourself with a little cold cream on the hands, and also through exercises. No showing.
Keep your head up and push it back as far as possible. And then back to your chest as far as possible. Doing this 5 minutes every evening before going to sleep is a good exercise. This also prevents a double chin.
Ui, Gewalt.
You must remember, however, that doing this once and then no more will not bring the desired results. You must take care of your body regularly so that your beauty will be harmonized and complete. Your beauty will possess true charm, will not be vulgar, will not tear at the eyes, but caress the eyes of those who look at you. That is what I wish for you, my dear sisters, with all my heart. That is why I write these articles. If we must be poor, let us be clean. And therefore, beautiful, too.
Bessie wasn't the only one writing a newspaper column. Boris had not only his own column, he had his own newspaper. It was called the Yiddish Theater, and he wrote in it about the role and purpose of the thespian art.
We are moving toward the day when we in the theater must care for the souls of our audience. We must educate them and take them by the hand and lead them to the edges of the thinnest ice, further than they would ever dare. Let them look and consider, and then safely bring them home again. The closest I ever got to this ideal vision was the years I ran the People's Theater. The People's Theater was on the Bowery and had next to the Hippodrome the largest stage in New York.
A big split in the Yiddish theater repertoire was between the literary plays, the high-flown dramas and biblical epics, and the so-called shunt or crap plays. More charitably, perhaps they could be called comedies, satires, farce. Marx Brothers films have a strong kinship to Schunt. The Schunt plays were boffo and over the top, but they concerned serious issues being played out in the lives of the audience, namely reversal of fortune. An old world Macher becomes a new world Schmendrick and vice versa. Capital versus labor, women's rights, assimilation, all considered with plenty of songs and jokes and star personalities. These shows paved the way for later musicals like Showboat, South Pacific, West Side Story, popular entertainments about controversial subjects. Now, Boris used the money from his big hits to bankroll serious repertoire that would expand his audience's horizon. He did plays by Dimov, Ash, and Sholem Aleichem, but he also presented controversial plays that were forbidden at the time on the English-speaking stage. Plays like Gorky's Lower Depths, Ibsen's Ghosts, Wilde's Salome with Bessie doing the dance of the seven schmatas. And in 1904, he topped it all with a Yiddish version of Wagner's Parsifal, accompanied by the orchestra of the Metropolitan Opera. Now, Pay the Bills repertoire included Boris's adaptation of things like The Three Musketeers. Everybody was in this. When I was a boy reading The Three Musketeers, I raised my glass at dinner one night and exclaimed, "To the Cardinal, to Richelieu." I turned to Bessie and said, "Grandma, you know who Richelieu was?" She said, "Do I know? Sure, it was Uncle Greenberg." And any play in an exotic location that could feature Cousin Hochstein could be a hit. Now, Hochstein was the foreign language expert of the Yiddish Theater. He played roles in French, Italian, Chinese, any language no one in the audience was expected to speak. And in every play, he always said the same thing, which was Popik pa, saranda davasa, yufla lumpa. So if it were a French play, he'd say, Popik pa, saranda davasa, yufla lumpa. And if it were an Italian part, he'd say, Popik pa, saranda davasa, yufla lumpa. And of course, if it were a Chinese part, he'd say, Popik pa, saranda davasa, yufla lumpa. But no matter what repertoire was being played, getting a full house on a weeknight remained a challenge. Solution: the birth of the benefit. The People's Theater offered benefit sponsors a choice of at least 20 plays. How was that possible? The actors were inspired improvisers, and they worked under the guidance of a prompter. Bessie told me that often she came to the theater not knowing what play was being done that night. But it turned out she was a great improviser, especially in comedy, which rocketed her to stardom. She scored especially in trouser parts. 40 years later, her wardrobe trunk in Hollywood was still stuffed with boys' clothes. In fact, the first set of tails I ever put on was hers. Her on-stage girl-is-boy personality really broke him up, and musically, she became far more comfortable in an American style.
I caught on to this and wrote the first of the so-called green plays. Green short for greenhorn. The first was the Grüne Buche, the green boy. Bessie ate it up right down to the scenery. I saw a gold mine in this show and dashed off a series of green sequels, all starring Bessie center stage, all on her own. More and more cash poured in, and I had more and more time off to go out and spend it. But how could Bessie complain? I had made her the headliner. In quick succession came The Green Maid. Then, only a few weeks later, Bessie had him in stitches with The Green Tailor. By this time, we realized anything with the word green in it would sell. So out of our hats, we pulled the Green Schlemiel. Next came, how about it, Professor? The Green Musician. We were desperate for new material and threw in anything, like our patriotic Yiddish Theater version of the Our Gang comedies, The Green Children.
Well, Bessie was exalted and exhausted by all these greens. It was damn hard work, it turned out, being a headliner. In later years, when people asked her, Mrs. Thomashefsky, wasn't it amusing being a star? She'd say, yeah, amusing. Man kann lachen mit Jastrikas. You could laugh with leeches. But she, like Boris, had become a star whose name alone could sell out a performance. Boris and Bessie discovered they had an empire. They had their own theater, publishing company, newspapers. They adopted an expansive lifestyle.
On impulse, I bought a grand house in Brooklyn, a country estate in Hunter-on-Hudson, and started buying and leasing theaters all over the country.
I had never expected to come so far, so fast. It had been about 15 years since I had begun my career as an actress, and here I was already the lady of two houses. All my loved ones, dear God, should have such homes. And all my enemies should have such homes. and not be able to afford them.
Well, Boris played it high, wide, and handsome on and off the stage. Years before, from the first moment when they arrived in New York, he had set the tone.
We went to Baum's Cafe to meet New York Theater's in crowd. As we walked in, they sized us up. We sat down to a good feed and a good schmooze. At the end of the meal, I picked up the check for everybody. The whole shooting match whispered amongst themselves, but I signaled to Bessie not to take any notice. We said our adieus and made our exit. Walking home, Bessie asked me,
Why do you have to go and pay for everybody when all we had was a couple of cents between us?
Listen, bougie. Those clowns should understand right away who Boris Thomashefsky is.
Over the years, his generosity grew more expansive. Patrons of the Yiddish cafes he frequented understood that when Thomashefsky showed up, they were all his guests. His grand style became legendary and was celebrated in song by the composers of Shine On Harvest Moon, Nora Bayes, and Jack Norworth. 1, 2, 3, 4. When Caruso's on the stage, he thinks he is mighty fine. And in Matt, he thinks he is the rage. Maybe so, but not for mine. You know that Georgie Cohan makes me sick with his Yankee, Banky, Spanky, little dude, thick. Now my sister read an actor, a real-life Yiddish actor. She saw him act and said, Oi, I'm for you. Well, who do you suppose went and married my sister? Don't you know? Give a guess. Thomashefsky. I know if I told you it would knock you a twister. That's a dandy name. Dang, I've been a fan. My father said an actor ain't no business, no how. But Shefsky's got a bankroll big enough to choke a cow. Who do you suppose went and married my sister? Don't you know? Give a guess. Thomashefsky. Thomashefsky's got it all. Fancy mansions, classic cars. What's his breakfast? Champagne caviar. Man, he slings them like a czar. Diamond garters, spats, top hats are amongst his classy stuff. So even when he's slumming, you always see him coming. The best for Boris, never good enough. Well, who do you suppose went and married my sister? Don't you know? Give a guess. Thomashefsky. I know if I told you it would knock you a twister. That's a dandy name. Dang, I've been a fan. My father said an actor ain't no business, no how. But Shefsky's got that bankroll big enough to choke a cow. Who do you suppose went and married my sister? Don't you know? Give a guess. Thomashefsky. Thomashefsky struts his stuff when he's on or off the stage. Schmeichling, schmoozing, spieling up a storm. Everything by him's front page. And if he spots your talent, little girl, you could take off, ba-ba-woo! So why don't you audition? There's just one small condition. You gotta do it in his dressing room. Well, who do you suppose went and married my sister? Don't you know? Give a guess. Thomashefsky. I know if I told you it would knock you a twister. That's a dandy name. Dang, I've been a fan. My father said an actor ain't no business, no how. But Shefsky's got the options on the best of here and now. Who do you suppose went and married my sister? Don't you know? Give a guess. Don't you know? Give a guess. Don't you know? Give a guess. Thomashefsky. That's him.
Look who's a Thomashefsky. In these years, we were money mashuga. Nobody knew where it was all going. But I am by nature a level-headed and practical person, and I never forgot to think about tomorrow. Whenever I could, I put away a little something. I had seen enough actors who had been stars and were suddenly forgotten. From time to time, I helped them out. But Boris didn't want to think about the future. Boris was a person who lived only for today. Finally, I cornered Boris in the bathtub, and I talked truth to him. I told him, look at us. We can't play these young roles forever. It's embarrassing. We've got to think of a future. Oi, oi. It's a changing world.
From now on, Bessie wanted to know exactly where the money was going, especially as she realized how much of it she was making. She found out lots of it was missing. Everybody had had his hand in the till, especially those untalented family members manning the box office. Bessie wanted to prosecute, bring in accountants, establish order, but Boris wanted to keep peace in the family and keep the true extent of his own expenses hidden. The whole family took sides, and Bessie and Boris were increasingly estranged. What was the solution? A new building project, a new start in a new theater, the National.
Yiddish stars wanted to make their way north from the Bowery with its noise and stink to a cleaner, more genteel neighborhood like 2nd Avenue. The National Theater to be built at Houston and 2nd would be the portal to it all. But how to bankroll it? I put together a new partnership with the Minsky brothers, the famous burlesque moguls. Let me tell you, those Minskys had very little interest in legitimate theater, but they had a great interest in a roof garden restaurant to display the assets of singing waitresses. I struck a deal with them to build the most elegant theater in New York and then set off on a European tour.
But when Boris returned from Europe a year and a half later, he discovered the Minskys had ratted on their understanding. They gave him his lobbies with all the gold and velvet he'd required, but they had economized by making a small and shallow stage that couldn't begin to do what People's Theater had done.
We started rehearsing our opening production, The Jewish Crown. Naturally, the show sold out even before we opened. But during rehearsals, I lost control of myself. The tiny stage was strangling me. I beat my fist against the brick. I kicked the gilt columns of the proscenium. I shouted, "Move back, you stone son of a bitch!" But mostly, I beat myself up. I collapsed, and they carried me to my dressing room. Yes, I made money and built the first and most popular 2nd Avenue theater. But a big part of my dreams was dead.
As the director of a new theater, Boris had to think about new plays and actors to attract a new audience. He brought in great artists like Schildkraut and later Ben-Ami, but he also needed actors who could be charming in the grind-em-out potboilers that were necessary for survival. Someone told Boris about an actress in Lemberg who might be appropriate. Enter Mrs. Zuckerberg. She was just like Bessie. She had modeled herself on her. She looked like her, dressed like her, talked like her, but she was 20 years younger, less clever, and fawningly adored Boris. He succumbed. At first, Bessie ignored the situation. She had endured so much in the past. What was another fling? But increasingly, she couldn't ignore the queen-like treatment Mrs. Zuckerberg was getting. Bessie collapsed, took to her bed for weeks, not talking or eating. Reading the newspaper, she saw that more plays at the National were planned, starring not her, but La Zuckerberg, who Bessie called Madame Floufla.
Finally, I accepted the situation with Madame Floufla, but I knew that I wanted to get even with Boris and make him suffer as I had. I thought to myself, why shouldn't I do what he does? If I wanted, men would fall on their knees in front of me, so why not? I didn't owe Boris anything after how he had treated me. My desire to live returned, and I wanted to be independent. I wanted to prove to Boris and to everyone that I was not over the hill yet, neither as a woman nor as an actress.
Well, Boris and Bessie tried to keep up appearances. All the gossip and controversy was great publicity. Were they playing together? Were they living together? It all sold more tickets. But the charade was too much to keep up. Suspecting that a part of Boris was beyond her reach forever, Bessie decided to walk out. She ordered the maids to take her valises into the waiting taxis below, just as Boris was getting back from one of his sprees. The way my father remembered her exit speech was,
"Welcome home. You look terrible." "Good. I'm leaving you." "The children?" "I'm leaving them right here for you to take care of. They'll take your mind off La Zuckerberg." "Oh, yes, and I'm taking along copies of all your plays. Alexander, Yeshiva Bucher, all of them. Want to know why? Because I'm going to play them. Any place you play, I'll be there just before or right after. I'll act you right off the stage. People will remember me, not you. You chase after a dozen Zuckerbergs for all I care, but I don't think you'll find the time. Because the great matinee idol Boris Thomashefsky is gonna be a busy boy, playing his own plays, keeping his own house, and making his own money. Goodbye."
Gutsy lady, huh? Well, exit speeches are all very well, but now Bessie was suddenly adrift. Without Boris, she had no theater to play in. She was uncertain who her friends really were. But good as her word, she started her own exclusive art company. It was rough going at first. They were about to fold when Thomashefsky, the young pianist from her orchestra, approached her with the score for a new musical. The piece was Chanche in America. In a flash, she saw that it was the perfect vehicle for her, and she decided to risk all by hawking her jewelry and producing it herself. The gamble paid off. Bessie created an archetypal character, the wisecracking, in-the-know girl later played by actresses like Fanny Brice. Chanche is a girl who comes to the United States with a big dream. She wants to drive a car. But being a woman, she knows she doesn't stand a chance. So she assumes male identity, goes to driving school, and becomes the chauffeur of a rich Yeke family. As the trusted chauffeur, she's in on all the family's secrets. And at the end of the show, she reveals her true identity and rallies the neighborhood girls to her suffragette cause. Now, this number became Bessie's signature tune, played as she walked into restaurants and benefits, and later by me as she made her triumphant entrance into our living room in the San Fernando Valley.
Women have been needed, badly treated, cheated since the world began. But I got a better plan. Makes as good as any man. Women aren't cattle, toys to rattle, chattel. This is Mister's rules. Wear his rags and sport his jewels like silly fools. We're sick and tired, mired in housekeeping, of the washing, weeping, schlepping, schlooping, creeping, obeying every whim of Model Yassel Jim. Fertig, arise, arim! Henchy, simple suffragette, not fancy, down on the land sea. Ladies expect to elect a respectable candidate like him. can't she? She deserves a little chancey. So girls, my quote, grab your coat, get the vote, steal some liberty and love. Kanche is a lady schöne Ganze. Oi, 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 Kanche. Ach, Vater, hält nicht gespennt, blinkeret, heb die Hände für Kanche, Kanche. Nor wie a policeman spanse. Oi, 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 Kanche, no Kanche, no Kanche, bescheid die ganze Welt. Everybody, yeah, yeah, da, 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 da. The next president, she's gonna be a girl. What do you say, ladies? Heb die Hände, Kanche. Kanche's auf dem Feld. Oi, 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 Kanche, no Kanche, no Kanche, bescheid die ganze Kanche, no Kanche, no Kanche. Kanche, no Kanche, no Kanche, bescheid die ganze Welt.
Bessie! Oh, her triumph was amazing and also annoying. And now I had to do something new. For the first time, I put myself on stage as a grotesque comic character, Putukanov, the Iceman, in the play The Green Millionaire.
In this play, an Iceman and a coal merchant live in a wretched basement. They write letters and send photographs home, bragging about their wonderful life in America. The show's hit tune looked at everything about the Golden Land and laid it squarely on the shoulders of the man who was clearly responsible, Columbus.
Amerika am Dienele, am Echayach leben, es riet durch ihre Schienele, wir sollen a sein Leben.
Willkommen, Spix in Menschenblit, dachen mir auf Zures, a kippen at the Dabmanit, der Kaiser auf Kopuris.
Oi, sind sie Jeden mit. Und leben soll Columbus, trinkt wieder nach der Haie. Und leben soll Columbus, läuft an dem Land hinein. Seite Lieder, greift er in die Trommes, schreite Lieder. Leben soll Columbus, und leben soll Columbus, trinkt wieder nach der Haie. Und leben soll Columbus, läuft an dem Land hinein. Seite Lieder, greift er in die Trommes, schreite Lieder. Leben soll Columbus, leben soll Columbus. America, a little place, oh, it's good to be here. From coast to coast, she shines with grace, no one bends a knee here.
People free to come and go, no Kaisers or Caesars. Way up in heaven or down below, no passports or visas.
Drink with me, toast a glass of tea. Oh, long life to Columbus, drink butchers, bakers, tailors. Oh, long life to Columbus, for him and all his sailors. Let's be thankful, bless his steady compass. Lift your glasses, long life to Columbus. Oh, long life to Columbus, drink butchers, bakers, tailors. Oh, long life to Columbus, for him and all his sailors. Let's be thankful, bless his steady compass. Lift your glasses, long life to Columbus. Life is on Columbus.
The next years were filled with big projects for Boris. He went on playing his box office smashes and also took big risks with avant-garde pieces like the Zerbrochene Fiedele. The 1916 audience was stunned by the spectacle which paralleled the big cinema hit of that same year, D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. And socially and politically, he was full of ambitions. He founded the first theatrical union in America, the Hebrew Actors Union. And he toured all over the world and was...
Perhaps my most amazing project was starting my own army. On tour in Argentina, I came across a gang of tough, knife-wielding Jews. I called them my Yiddish gauchos. I brought them first to New York and sponsored their voyage to Palestine, where they became a Jewish protection organization. Out of gratitude, they called themselves the Thomashefsky Legionnaires. Later, they became a brigade in the British Army, the 13th Royal Fusiliers.
And I swear, ladies and gentlemen, this is all true. Meanwhile, Bessie had secured her position as a star and independent producer. She played her familiar trouser parts, invented new comedies, and true to her word, she took on Boris's greatest roles with great success. Her new plays mostly centered on women's issues. Perhaps the most important one was Minke the Dienstmeid, Minke the serving girl. Here's the plot. A high-class doctor and his cultivated wife sit in their library reading. She comes upon a monograph on birth control. She's electrified by the discovery of this information, which she wants to share with all other women, especially unmarried girls. The doctor says if she does this, it will encourage free love and anarchy and shake the roots of society. He threatens to divorce her. Anyone would make a better wife than she. For example, Minke, their fresh-off-the-boat Eastern European serving girl. For the character of Minke, Bessie invented a whole new accent, an Eastern jargon of low origin, including the expression avö for vus. It became a household word. Her monologue, Minke on the telephone, was one of her most famous bits.
Avo, yes. Who's speaking? Das bin ich, Minke, der Dienstmeid beim Telefon. Doctor, you can bald daheim. Avo. Yeah, you hear what you're sure. What you do, doctor, at the gymnasium? Atish. Was gestern etwas durch den Telefon? Avo, ihr meint es nicht. That's a bad doctor. Yeah, goodbye.
Well, eventually, Minke does become the doctor's wife, and she's determined to make a success of her marriage. She feeds him, takes care of him, tries to drum up business for him, just like she used to do for her uncle the butcher. After all, her uncle cut meat, the doctor cuts people. What's the big difference? But having Minke as a wife is too embarrassing for the doctor. She looks great, but every time she opens her mouth, she gives herself away. Finally, he tells her he's had it with Knedlach and is divorcing her.
Divorcing me? Avo, you're divorcing me. You trifled with me, you used me. You think you can just throw me away? Oh no, mister. I'm taking you for everything you got, Mr. High-Class Fancy Schmenzy Doctor. I'll get your money and I'll use it to educate my family. You look out, because poor little Minka's a real person and she's taking what's hers. Yeah.
And so she does. In the last scene, a sentimental reunion between the doctor and his first wife is wrecked by the arrival of Minke and a whole gang of street toughs. They strip everything from the house, the furniture, the paintings, the drapes, even the jewelry on the first wife's fingers. And laughing, they make their triumphant exit into the night. became the director of the Yiddish section of the Federal Theater Project. He tried out a new show on Broadway, a musical in English, a language which he spoke very well. It was called The Singing Rabbi. The rehearsals were great, but on opening night, Boris made his entrance, received an ovation, and then just stared at the audience for a painfully long time. Finally, he began to speak, but somehow he could only speak in Yiddish. The curtain came down, the show closed. After this, Boris was to be seen regularly with Mrs. Zuckerberg at the Romanian restaurant Cabaret, where after dinner they presented numbers from his hit shows. It was all the Thomashefsky bits everybody wanted to see and remember. But it hurt people who had known Boris at his height to see how much of a caricature of himself he was becoming. He still wore stovepipe hats and capes and behaved like Thomashefsky as he sauntered between the tables. But people still loved him, and the great and near great made their way through the doors of his establishment. Everybody had a story of what he had meant to them.
Ah, memories. It makes me proud to see how well all the youngsters are doing. Jolson, Cantor, Sophie Tucker, and little Georgie Gershwin. They all used to hang around when they were kids. Irving Berlin was a singing waiter when I first saw him. I ran into him the other day, and he showed me a $20 gold piece I had tipped him over 20 years ago. Still keeps it in his vest pocket for luck. Ah, gitter mazel.
In 1939, Boris passed away, and it was then that all of New York gave him a truly splendid send-off. His funeral was a major cultural event. The whole Lower East Side closed down, and according to the New York Times, over 30,000 people paraded for blocks behind his coffin. The papers were filled with grateful thanks. Boris had given so many people their start and helped them shape their dreams in a new land. And oh yes, Boris made movies. The only surviving one is Bar Mitzvah, which he made in his late 60s. What I see when I watch this film is a great singer and generous performer. Notice the way he looks at the Bar Mitzvah boy and the way he looks out at us. He's in the very last days of his career, but his performance is still animated by energy and affection.
Gedenke mein Kind, du's erzählen. Lass sein Kind fein, dort überall, Stücke gibt Menschenlieb, Christ, die ganz egal. Lass sein Kind fein, dort überall, Stücke gibt Menschenlieb, Christ, die ganz egal.
Bessie kept at her career expanding into vaudeville, touring Europe. She wrote a couple of more autobiographies, each written with greater candor. From time to time, she searched for an ideal man, but she had never divorced Boris, and she never forgot him.
Boris and I were a mistake, but it was a beautiful mistake. And there are some mistakes that no matter how much they hurt you, you never want to let go of. From time to time, you raise them to your lips, and as you go to your grave, you press them firmly to your heart.
On stage, Bessie threw herself completely into her new plays. Most followed her successful formula. A woman in disguise spies out and exposes the perfidies of men. But in some of them, there's a new plot twist. In plays like Wie Männer lieben, The Way Men Love, Bessie succeeds in bringing one of the men to his senses, reforming him, and making of him a loving and respectful partner. So I imagine Bessie, starved for loving words in her life, relished the opportunity as a producer to create situations on stage where her leading man would tenderly look into her eyes and sing songs like this. In the late 30s, Bessie moved out to Hollywood to see what was doing in the movie business.
New York had become a place with too many ghosts. Hollywood seemed to be a gold mine for character actors. And did I have character? Besides, the town was full of kids who used to sell programs and potatoes in our lobbies. Now they ran the studios. Gar nicht helfen. Somehow I managed to get a screen test for the part of a landlady in a Ginger Rogers picture. I gave it my all, but they said I wasn't stereotypically Jewish enough. What do they know? I knew who that landlady was, and I respected her, and I wasn't going to turn on the groans and the gimmicks and make her into a cartoon.
Bessie was still a personality around town. Everybody in L.A. knew her. She could get in anywhere. She'd take me around town with her on the big red car to visit rehearsals and screenings. I remember her taking me onto the stage of the Pasadena Playhouse. We stood hand in hand on the empty stage. And she said, "Look up there, Mechla. You see up there, there's an exit sign. And beyond that, another exit sign. And still further, another exit sign. Well, where that last exit sign is, that's called the gallery. And up there are sitting people who pay the least money, but who enjoy the show the most. Make sure whatever you're doing on the stage, whether it's singing or yelling or whispering, make sure those people up there always get it." Sometimes she blew smoke rings and watched them float up to the ceiling as she explained to me who she had been.
I went through it all. Actrice, attraction, prima donna, headliner, and finally, genius. So, who's a genius? Bernhard, Duse, Mrs. Adler? They said I was a genius. So what's being a genius? I don't know. It's a changing world. You could go to a school, but I don't really know what they teach you. Maybe being a genius is like my grandma's recipe for strudel. You go to the kitchen, you tie up your hair, you put on a clean apron, you wash your hands, and you make the strudel.
The last time I saw Bessie, she gave me one of her looks. I guess we both knew it might be the last time. She sighed and said, "Oi, Mechele, so much is going to happen to you. Your grandma wouldn't be there to advise you, so remember now her last words. Remember, Mechele, no matter what will happen, never, never sign a release." I think about them both so much. His vision, his sense of community, his sense of building a future based on the courage and vision of music and the arts. And I think about her. As I sit in my dressing room before a performance, I search my own mirror for traces of me before I go on as Beethoven, Mahler, or Stravinsky. And then, following my grandma's advice, I wash my hands, I comb my hair, I put on a clean tie, I go to the stage, and I make the strudel. Thank you, everybody. We've still got a couple of numbers up our sleeve from Jewish vaudeville, but you got to promise to mix it. Here we go.
We're changing our addresses. We're changing social classes. Our friends will make a pause. Maybe even wish that they were us. No. Not even half of a mile. We're moving up in my style. We're moving on the wall. Now we live like contributed miles. Say тобою